Great. So everyone, welcome to this session of the 2024 Culture of Data Conference. Thank you for joining us right after lunch. I'm Lala Kaiser. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be moderating this session. We also have Sam Gary, who uses he, him pronouns, who is managing the Zoom and making sure all of the technology is working. Everybody should be muted now, but if you have a question during the Q&A, feel free to unmute, and I encourage you to unmute. It makes it a lot better to have a conversation. However, you can also use the chat box if you have questions or really if you need anything. Right now, if you are comfortable doing so, please add your pronouns to your Zoom name by clicking the little 3 dots in your video square and selecting rename. We will have one presentation during this session. They will present for approximately 25 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and then some final announcements at the very end. So I'm actually super excited for this presentation because my colleague that I adore is presenting, Zach Giano. He'll be talking about latent profile analysis, a statistical method used to identify clusters of similar individuals. And they applied this method to the Youth Behavioral Risk Factor Survey. So now I'll turn it over to Zach for his presentation.
Great. Thank you, Lala. I appreciate you. And shout out also to Sam as well. We appreciate all the behind the scenes work that everyone does to make this happen. You can hear me okay? Great. Okay. So yeah, I'm Zach Giano. I also did this in conjunction with Mary Samuel. And this is sort of a mouthful, but I'm going to be presenting on using latent profile analysis as a unique way to visualize. Let me just move my Zoom screen there. Yep, to visualize and analyze data with illustration using the Youth Behavioral Risk Factor Survey. Sort of a mouthful. I am a part of CU Anschutz. Our department's acronym, it's basically called CIDA, stands for Center for Innovative Design and Analysis. I'm a biostatistician for CIDA. We have sort of a whole department of stats teams that handle a lot of the data analysis on the Anschutz campus. So let's see here. Great. So a caveat is this presentation actually was derived from a paper I got published about 3 years ago. It's using the same latent profile analysis. I'm going to describe what we did and how this adds to the culture of data, really. So some background on this. So, and actually, I should maybe have a caveat here. So this paper deals with the domain of suicide. So I just wanted to make sure that it is a little bit of a serious topic before I begin. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for 15 to 19-year-olds in the United States. And this is not just LGBT youth, LGBT youth. This is across the board, heterosexual included. And this, unfortunately, gets worse for LGB youth, are almost 5 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to heterosexual youth. I will also note that this does not include transgender youth who estimates are maybe 10 to 15 times that of heterosexual youth. So really what we know is that youth and adolescent suicide and suicidality is a problem, 1. 2, it's an even bigger problem for youth who identify as a sexual or gender minority. Another sort of alarming and startling statistic is that LGBT youth attempting suicide are 4 to 6 times more likely to result in injury, poisoning, or overdose compared to their heterosexual counterparts. So even when LGBT youth attempt suicide, the outcomes, if they live, the outcomes are worse. They're more likely to have injuries, prone to poisoning, overdose, that sort of thing. So it's an ongoing issue, unfortunately, and there a lot of current interventions that are trying to tackle this problem. Unfortunately, I was just reading a couple of articles the other day. The the stats are not getting any better on this topic. So there's still a lot of work to be done in this domain. Okay, so some limitations of looking at LGB suicidality. One is there's a lack of studies examining within groups. So we have a panoply of studies really that compare heterosexual youth to sexual and gender minority youth. No shortage of studies there. And really, they all point to the same thing, is that if you identify as LGBT, you are at greater risk of worse mental health and suicidality. But there's not a lot of studies that look at just a within groups context. And so when we say within groups, it means just not comparing that to any other reference group. It means looking within a stratified subset population and looking at differences within that group. There's not a whole lot of studies that just do within group, because a lot of the studies use a heterosexual comparison group. Another limitation is sample size limitation. So data from LGBT individuals, so not just youth, data on LGBT individuals it's hard to get. It's not easily accessible data, and it's even harder to get that from youth. There's a lot of red tape. Anytime you collect youth data, it's because they're minors, it's more difficult to get. You are limited in the questions you're allowed to ask. And so the data is just difficult and hard to get. Very few studies have more than 500 LGB youth. A lot of these studies are smaller sample size studies, which is still fine. The problem is anytime you have a smaller sample, you're just limited in what you can do statistically with that sample. There's not a whole lot of things you can do with a small sample. And that's really why, and these kind of go in conjunction together, that's really why when you have a smaller sample, one of the easiest things to do is compare it to another sample. It basically doubles your whole sample size if you have a comparison group, right? And so just looking at within LGB youth is difficult because those data are hard to get and you're limited by sample size. Okay, so in the study that I conducted, we used YRBS. So and actually, I want to explain this for a minute. The CDC sponsors two national data collection programs. One is called the BRFSS. That's for adults. If you heard that before, it's called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. The YRBS is that same, well, it's a little bit modified, but it's through the same CDC program. It's a national study, and this is the youth version. And this is through 9th through 12th grades. And the BRFS, the adult one, they collect those data every year. The youth one collects every other year. And so what we used for this study was we combined the 2015 and 2017 YRBS data sets. And in total, we had about 2,700 LGB youth in the final sample. And actually, I should make a note here. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using LGB. The YRBS does not ask about transgender identification or status. They only ask for sexual minority and not gender minority. I think this would be really interesting, and there's a lot of study needed in transgender youth. These data just didn't collect that. So throughout the presentation, I'll be referencing LGB because we just didn't have transgender data. Okay, so through those data, what we wanted to look at was suicidality in these LGB youth. And we were a little bit limited in factors that we could study because we had to use which variables were already included in the data set. There would be a list of 10 to 20 variables that might be indicators or predictors of suicide. But unless that variable was in the data set and unless they asked those youth in those survey, then we couldn't use it. So we were a little bit limited. So what we did was, and I'll spare the long literature review here, but what we did was we looked at all those variables and we said, okay, let's take a look at the research, take a look at the literature, and let's see which variables could be a possible indicator of suicidality in youth. And so what we came up with that matched the variables in the data set was 5 things. So bullying, which also included in-person bullying as well as electronic bullying, alcohol use, poor academic performance, poor grades, high electronics use, which we were not expecting, which is a good reason why literature reviews are so important here, because we did not know that that could possibly be an indicator of poor mental health and suicidality. But we did find that youth that had high rates of electronic use it was an indicator of poor mental health and suicidality. And then, of course, poor sleep was one of the biggest predictors that kept coming up. Youth that are not getting enough sleep generally have poor mental health outcomes. So those were the 5 variables that we used, and we thought, okay, how can we use these variables and see of these 2,700 LGB youth, how could we model this to see which variables are associated with suicidality? And so typically in the research, a lot of studies are variable-centered. We call them variable-centered approaches. One very common variable-centered approach is called regression. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. So what you could do is you could put all these variables or indicators in a model, and then you could have an outcome, and you could model that. And we call this a linear regression. And so you can put a bunch of predictors in there and see what comes out, see which ones are significantly associated with your outcome. And what you would get is a regression coefficient. And so you can get one for the whole model, and then you can get individual coefficients per predictor. And what that does is it'll tell you for each individual predictor how much that's associated with your outcome. So for instance, you might get a coefficient, and you could say for every X times that this happens, your outcome increases this amount of times. So it's a linear relationship between individual predictors and an outcome. But there's a lot of limitations for this. And actually, I should say, if you go on Google Scholar and you just type in any kind of topic that you're interested in, there's probably, I don't know, 90% chance that they're just going to use some sort of variable-centered approach. They're just going to use some sort of regression or some sort of group differences, maybe an F-test, ANOVA, something like that. And these aren't bad, but there are some limitations to variable-centered approaches. So one limitation is that it gives an average effect for all members of the population. So let me just go back here to this graph. So if you have a coefficient for any given variable here, let's just say bullying, that will give you the relationship between bullying and suicide attempts for the entire sample that you studied. So it doesn't account for any kind of clustering or groups of students. It's an average effect across everyone. And I just sort of mentioned this, it inherently ignores clusters of individuals who have unique behavioral characteristics. One other analogy is that, if you were going to look at, let's just say, hours studied for a test and test scores, you can get a coefficient for that hour studied for a test. So for every extra hour any given student studies for a test, maybe their test score increases by 3 points, right? And so there's a relationship there. But we all know that it's not the same for everyone. There might be a group of students who just don't really study at all, who happen to get really high grades. Conversely, there's the opposite can happen. You can have a group of students who study way more than they need to, and they just get bad grades. But you don't really get those relationships in a variable-centered approach because, again, the coefficients here are an average effect for everyone. So we're just saying, well, yeah, we know that there's different clusters of students, maybe, maybe not, we don't know, but on average, these are the results for everyone. And part of the problem with that is when studies do this, they use those results to build their implications. And so for that analogy that I just gave, that would be fine. Sure, you could say, if you want to increase your test scores, then you need to study more hours. But we know that that's probably fine for an average, but for everyone, it's sort of a mislabeled implication, if you will, because it does ignore groups of students who are not represented because you're using a variable-centered approach. And so we call this the one size fits all. So when you interpret those regressions, we're saying, all right, there might be groups of students, but we don't know, but here's this result. And so these results are the average effect for everyone. So it's a one size fits all answer. Which again, I don't want to criticize variable-centered approaches because I think it gives a really good landscape and snapshot of what's happening, but it lacks some nuance in the results and implications. So what latent profile analysis is, we also call this LPA. So if you read or see that in the literature, they're synonymous, is a person-centered approach. And so this is a little bit different than variable-centered approach. And so some strengths of an LPA is that it develops profiles, we also call them classes, profile characteristics in groups of individuals. And so the other benefit of this is that you can use these, it's called a profile to outcome pipeline, right? So profile to outcome possibility, where you can create these profiles and then link those profiles to an outcome. And that's more of a person-centered approach than a variable-centered approach. So, and I'll explain sort of what this means. So for instance, we had these 5 predictors that we knew provided some sort of indicator to suicidality. And we ran a latent profile analysis with these predictors. And what we came up with is a 6-class solution. And so what this means is that based on those 5 characteristics, those 5 variables, the latent profile analysis grouped everyone into 6 profiles or classes. Again, those terms are synonymous. So within each class, it's pretty homogeneous. So in class 1, they all had similar means of all 5 of those characteristics. So class 1, they were all similar in bullying, alcohol use, their grades, electronic use, and their sleep habits. But class 1 is distinctly different from class 2, which is distinctly different from class 3, and so on. So within each class, they're all similar, but the classes are distinctly different from one another. And this is what the classes look like. So these are z-scores, so they're all standardized. And so you have 6 classes. Let's take a look at actually class 2. So if you were an LGB youth in this sample, really the best class you could have been put in would be class 2. They had lower rates of bullying, lower rates of alcohol use, lower rates of poor grades, which means they had better grades than the average, less electronics use, and good sleep right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. I'm kind of circling here. Okay, great. So class 2 was the class that you would have hoped to be in. They had sort of the best outcomes based on those 5 variables. The other end of the spectrum, the worst class would be class 6. So they had the highest rates of bullying, being bullied, the highest rates of alcohol. They had the worst grades, high rates of electronic use, and they had the worst sleep, I believe, as well. Yeah. So class 2 was sort of the best class you could be put in. Class 6 was the worst class you can be put in. And again, everyone in class 1 had similar means, but distinctly different from all the other classes. I sort of cringe putting out a big table, but I sort of put it here for reference just in case I wanted to go back to it. But one of the cool things with latent profile analysis that you can do is once you make these profiles and these different classes, you can then put those profiles back into a variable-centered approach like a regression. And so that's exactly what we did. So based on your group membership, depending on which class you were in, you can then associate that with an outcome. So we use class 2 as a reference group. And again, remember, all of the classes in here, it's only LGB identified youth. So compared to class 2, class 1 had almost a 4 times more likelihood to attempt suicide. The dependent variable here we looked at was attempted suicide or not. And so class 1 was just about 4 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to class 2. Class 4 was also maybe just marginally higher than class 1, was 4 times as likely to attempt suicide. Class 5 was 4.1 times more likely. Class 3 was 11 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to class 2. And class 6, remember, class 6 was the worst class you could be in. They were almost 40 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to class 2. And so this gives you a more nuanced picture of what's going on. Because if you remember, going back to that variable-centered approach, that only gives you estimates per variable. This sort of gives you estimates on a person-centered characteristic rather than a variable-centered characteristic. So again, you can give a bullying coefficient that's a one-size-fits-all, or what latent profile analysis does is it groups these into classes, and then that's a more nuanced picture of what's going on. So now we have a profile of LGB youth who are in class 6. We have a profile of what those youth would look like, and we also have estimates of what group membership in that class 6, how that group membership is associated with an outcome, in this case, suicidality. So some implications from this that I think are also unique to latent profile analysis, and I'm going to put the groups here as a reference. So we know, across the board, high risk behaviors really equated to greater suicide risk. What we're really interested in, though, was some of the middle ground classes. So remember, class 2 was the best class you could be put in. Class 6 was the worst class. And those are, looking at those variables, you can see, okay, well, that makes sense, right? So youth who are extremely bullied and have substance use issues are probably more likely to be associated with suicidality than people in class 2 who weren't bullied and have low rates of substance use. But what we were really interested in is these sort of middle ground classes. So what about class 1, class 3, class 4, and class 5? How are those associated with suicidality? And one of the things that sort of emerged here was the combination of bullying and alcohol. And that's really represented here in class 3. They had high rates of bullying and alcohol. And they also had, let me go back to this, the odds ratios here, and they were 10 times as likely. So if you weren't going to be put in class 6, the next worst class you could be put in was class 3, which happened to have high rates of bullying and alcohol. One of the things that was surprising to us is that there weren't a lot of implications by age. The classes were pretty similar in age. One of the things we found in the literature is that the transition from middle school to high school can sometimes be traumatic, particularly for sexual and gender minority youth. And so we thought maybe class 6 might be closer to that transition age. There's also some research that says the older the adolescent is, the more likely that they're to attempt suicide, but those really didn't emerge. The other implication here is if you're a clinician, this gives you a better sense of what's going on, as opposed to reading an article with a variable-centered approach. Well, now, if you're a clinician, now you have sort of a blueprint profile of groups of LGB youth that may have similar characteristics. And based on those profiles, it helps you get a better sense of suicidality risk, and who might be at risk for that. And I think that's all I have, which I might be right on time. So here's my email. I will also copy this in the chat. I don't know if these slides are going to be available on the website or not, but please feel free to email if you have a question and you didn't get to ask it here. More than happy to talk about that. And thank you, Lala and Sam, for having me.
Thanks, Zach. So now we have some time for Q&A. If anybody wants to come off of mute and ask a question, or feel free to put it in the chat and I will read it out loud. Mary's here. Hi, Mary. You're getting a thank you for your presentation in the chat, Zach.
Oh, thank you for coming. I appreciate
I guess
it.
I'll start off with a question. So you mentioned the clinical use of these classes. And so I was wondering kind of how the translation of, the data and having these classes, how that translation into clinical use would happen. Like, would they, are there plans, or are you working with investigators to develop interventions to support LGBT youth based off of these classes, or what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Going back to this sort of variable-centered approach to person-centered approach, if you were a clinician and actually, let me go back to one of the slides here. So if you're a clinician, I think one of the things that helps get you a better understanding of people that you work with is this. I'm going to go back to this bullying and alcohol one. We see here that if you look at class 1 and class 4, they sort of have opposite problems, right? So one class has really high alcohol use, but they're not bullied. The other class gets bullied a lot, but they don't have they have lower than average, actually almost the lowest. I think class 2 still has the lowest, but class 4 still has a lower rate of alcohol use. And then class 3 here has both. As a clinician, I think getting a better understanding of all variables is important, and understanding individual variables and how they relate to any kind of outcome, in this case, suicidality, is important. But I think sort of a next level step of learning is not just looking at this as an individual variable approach, but looking at it as combinations of variables that create a profile. And so if you're a clinician and you're looking at this and you have a client, and your client, says that they have been bullied a lot and that they are struggling with alcohol use, if I'm looking at these results, I'm saying I'm thinking that that could be a pretty corrosive combination of variables that align with someone in one of these profiles. So again, if you're a clinician and you have a client that sort of fits in one of these profiles, I think that's a lot more useful in knowing and identifying someone that might be at risk, as opposed to reading an article and just looking at each one of these variables separately and just saying, okay, well, I know that bullying is associated, so I'll be on the lookout for that. I know that alcohol is associated, I'll be on the lookout for that. And again, that's good for really setting the landscape here. But I think the benefit of looking at data with latent profile analysis is now it makes it a little bit easier to identify someone based on profile characteristics here.
All right, I'm going to go in order. So we have one question in the chat and then two people with their raised hand. So the question in the chat was, have you done analyses with state level, i.e. HKCS data? And they say they ask because HKCS data does include gender minorities in recent years.
I have not, and I'm not familiar with HKCS. What is the what is the acronym?
That's Healthy Kids Colorado Survey. It's the Colorado version of the YRBS.
Interesting. I have not. And I think it's important to do so because these data that I used for this study, it's national data. And that is also a limitation of this because we know that if you're LGBT youth, it sort of matters where you live. I mean, place and context matter. If you're an LGBT youth in an urban area, um, generally there's more resources there. People are maybe a little bit more accepting of sexual and gender minorities, as opposed to living in the rural South or rural Midwest, which may have wildly different outcomes. And so I think this study is good at sort of framing, okay, here's a new way to look at data. But I think we need to get more granular than that. I think even Colorado is interesting because it's like there's a few urban areas and then everything else is very rural. So I think the more granular we can get, the better. And I would love to see something like this replicated, except in a more granular place level study. And using HKCS, is that free available public data?
They just
Yeah.
included a link. I'll send it to
Oh,
your email, Zach.
okay, great.
Cool. All right, I'll pass it off to Claudia.
Gracias, Lala. Thank you.
Con gusto.
Zach, hi.
Hi.
How are you? I haven't seen you in a while, but
Yes, good to see
I
you.
remember that. Nice to see you. I remember that we tried to do something similar with our data in rural areas. So my question, well, one was with the Healthy Kids Colorado survey, and I would like to follow up with some of the rural areas because you touch on minoritized populations, not only sex and gender identity, but also you mentioned maybe Latinos or rural, and I think that it would be nice to do. My question is the end that you have to have this type of analysis. That's one of the questions because you might be reaching, when you start dissecting into multiple groups, you need to have a really large sample size.
Yes.
And the other is that this doesn't take into consideration, you were trying to stratify according to the data that is available, like bullying, alcohol, poor grades, but you are, how are you considering other social structural determinants of health that might not be necessarily in that data but might definitely influence the perception of bullying, the reaction of the child that leads to suicidality if you have, I don't know, stronger family ties. How can you combine data that might not be so unified, if you will, like in the BRFS?
Totally. Great questions. Let me work backwards. So that is one of the limitations of this is we were limited by whatever data were in the YRBS. One of the things that, particularly for LGBT youth, that is a strong predictor of mental health outcomes is family acceptance. There was no data or no question that these youth were asked about, does your family accept you? Do you have a close relationship with your family? Also, peer relationships are really important for all youth, not just LGBT youth, but for all youth. And there was really no peer questions in there about, do you have a close social circle? Are you involved with extracurricular activities, things like that? And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, I think had I been designing the survey, there would have been, these variables would have been different. And I think there's a lot more variables that are not included here that should be included. And maybe that's something that, and I don't know what HKCS has in their data set, but yeah, I mean, I think that the more variables that are closely linked to the outcome, the better. Definitely a limitation here. There would be a bunch of variables I'd love to study. The first question you asked was about sample size. This is sort of a point of contention in the larger family is called mixture modeling. And under mixture modeling, one of those is latent profile analysis. So there's no hard and fast rule about, you need 100 you need 100 people or you need 200 people. You can do this with smaller sample sizes. You could run this with 100 people if you wanted to. The problem is, well, there's several problems. One is that when you run this, you may get really small classes. Because you only have 100 people, you may have 80 people in one class and then 4 people in another class. And when you start getting down to the really small cell sizes, it's still a legitimate way to run a latent profile analysis because those 4 individuals, they're still unique in their own right. But then you start running into power issues because when you only have a group that has 4 people, well, then it's harder to do anything after that. It's sort of the end of the road. So you can still run a latent profile analysis, but what you wouldn't be able to do is things like this. This was the step 2 that we did. First, we created those classes, and then based on that group membership, then we could do a logistic regression to get some odds ratios. You just wouldn't be able to do that second step if you didn't have enough people in there. But you can still run it. Even with small sample sizes, it'll still run. There's just less you can do with it after the fact.
Thank you for that very thoughtful question. I'll pass it off to Alexa.
Yeah, Zachary, thank you so much for sharing with us. I am obsessed with this presentation.
Oh.
I'm so glad I'm here.
Gosh, I'm flattered. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions, but some of them might be silly. I guess the first one is, how does the designing of these classes happen? Is that through the model, or do you pick which clusters of like characteristics you want together? I've never done anything like this.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so what you do, ideally you would run this, and then the program that I use for this is called M+. Ideally, you would just have M+ just give you the number of classes. What you need to do is you need to run the latent profile analysis. You tell it how many classes to group individuals in. So what you do is you first run a 2-class solution. A 1-class solution doesn't make any sense because that would just mean everyone is everyone. Everyone is just one group. So you start with a 2-class solution, and then you go up from there, and then you run a 3-class solution, 4-class, 5-class. I think we ran 2 through 8 classes. And then based on the output on the number of classes that you select M+ to put people in, you get different metrics. And those metrics can be compared to one another to see which class solution is the most optimal. And I'll also add that that's in this paper as well. We compared the different class models, and then we also have a table that compares the metrics. And you'll see it sort of goes, if you can kind of picture like a bell curve, once you run these class solutions, the metrics will tell you that a 3-class solution is much better fitting than a 2-class solution. And so then it goes up. And then it's a 5-class solution is better than a 4-class. And so it keeps going up. And then there's a drop off. And so we found that drop off after 6 classes. So 6 classes had the best fitting metrics. And then once we ran a 7-class solution, the metrics went down. And then once we ran an 8-class solution, the metrics went down even further. And so that's why we selected that 6-class solution. I'll also note that sometimes you might have 2 really good fitting solutions. So you might have, we didn't in this case, but you might have a 5-class solution and a 6-class solution that both have really, really good fitting metrics. When you have that happen, then you have a little bit of leeway in what you select. And there's also a couple of metrics that you can look at. So maybe in the 6-class solution, maybe one class only had 4 people. Whereas in the 5-class solution, the lowest class maybe had 30 people. And so sometimes there's a little bit of leeway in what is the optimal number of classes In this one, it was pretty clear. The 6th-class solution was the best fit for that.
Wow, thank you so much.
Sure.
That's such a great explanation. My other two quick questions, but I think actually one of those can probably be answered in your paper. You said there's a paper. Is it attached to the notes of this session?
It is not, but I am happy to put that up here.
Oh, okay. This is okay. Awesome. I took a picture of this earlier, so I will look it up.
Oh,
Okay.
great.
All right. I'll let other people ask questions. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.
Another person asked for the reference, so I'm pulling it up on PubMed so I can include it.
Oh, thank you, Lala.
Yeah. Any other questions? Feel free to come off mute and ask, or ask in the chat. We have time for maybe one more. Oh, there's one. Could you elaborate on the demographic makeup of each class, or at least the best and worst?
Yes, and that I don't know offhand, actually, which is also in the paper. I will tell you that in terms of the sizes, the class sizes were different, which is okay. You don't have to have equal profile or class sizes. The one sort of benefit that I did see is that the biggest class, and I think out of the 2,700, I think maybe 1,300 of them, if I remember correctly, so just over half was in class 2. And remember, class 2 was sort of the best you could get in here. I also remember the other class that had smaller. You know what? I don't know offhand. I would have to go back and reference that. But the class sizes are in the paper as well.
Thanks, Zach. So I think we're out of time for Q&A. Thanks everyone for attending this session, and a special thank you to Zach for his awesome paper, and for Mary, who is also on the call, for the awesome paper. The slides and any additional handouts will be available on the conference website. Also, everyone will receive a conference evaluation over email after the conference is over. If you fill that out, within 2 weeks, you'll be put into a raffle to win one of two $50 gift cards. So fill it out as part of the planning committee. I'll tell you, we take those surveys seriously. We love receiving feedback, and we love to implement it. So please give us feedback, even if you only attended a small part of the conference. And then now you'll have about a 15-minute break before the next concurrent session at 1:30. There's 2 sessions to choose from at that time, so you can check the conference website for the full schedule. Other than that, have a great day, and thank you, Zach, for your awesome presentation.
Thank you.